Within a couple of seconds, there were a number of armed security with great big airport machine guns.
An autism patient's daring escape from NHS psychiatric care pits her against some of the most powerful institutions in the state. From the multi-award-winning Sky News Storycast team, in partnership with The Independent, follow Patient 11, wherever you get your podcasts.
He is Israel's longest-serving Prime Minister, but also one of the most divisive figures in Israeli politics. And the popularity once enjoyed by Benjamin Netanyahu was fast waning long before the barbarism of the Hamas attacks on October 7th last year. Facing scrutiny over ongoing criminal charges and a backlash against his hard-right coalition government's plan to reform Israel's judicial system, King Bibi, as he's known by supporters and critics alike, is now further isolating himself with his strategy in Gaza and views on a two-state solution. I'm Niall Paterson, and on this edition of the Sky News Daily, our Middle East correspondent, Alistair Bunkall, and Israeli political analyst, Daliah Scheindlin, they're both with me to discuss the growing discontent and just how long Benjamin Netanyahu can keep his grip on power. Well, let's start with you, Alistair. Give us just a flavour of the level of dissatisfaction there is with Israel's Prime Minister, because I think if you are outside the country, I suspect it is pretty easy to think that Israelis are speaking with one voice right now.
Benjamin Netanyahu is an unpopular politician in Israel at the moment. He has been pretty much for the entire duration of his tenure, his most recent tenure as Prime Minister that started in January of last year. He's been unpopular for a number of different reasons. But right now, there are many Israelis who hold him responsible for what happened on October the 7th because he was the leader at the time, and he has always styled himself as Mr. Security, but many Israelis feel that he and others, but Netanyahu let them down and should have done more to protect Israel and protect, in particular, the Gaza border communities. To give you an idea, a poll earlier this month found that only 15% of Israelis believe that Netanyahu should be Prime Minister once the war finishes, whenever that might be. And if you compare that to someone like Benny Gantz, who is in opposition but currently in the war cabinet, well, Gantz is polling around 23-24%. So he's a much more popular individual politician. And so Netanyahu is under increasing pressure from a number of different angles.
And the way in which the dissent itself is manifesting is fascinating to me because of the compulsory nature. National service is almost part of the national psyche, but as you've discovered, we are finding young people refusing to join up with the IDF and preferring instead to spend time in jail.
The IDF is known here as the People's Army, and that can have two different effects. In one sense, it is a unifying factor on the citizens of Israel because the vast majority of Israelis all serve a form of national service. Even if they don't continue in the military, they do national service. And that is a common thread that runs through Israeli society. It also means that the Israeli military can be very powerful if it decides to take opposition to anything. But some people are dissenting, and one of those is a young guy called Tal Mitnick, an 18-year-old, who has refused to serve in the IDF. He got his call-up papers. He turned up at the recruitment office and said, no, I'm not going to serve. I'm a conscientious objector. I believe in peace. And so he was jailed for 30 days. I met him 2 days after he'd been released from jail and 2 days before he was due to answer the call of service again. And he did turn up, this was early this week, and he again refused, and he is now back in jail.
Violence doesn't solve problems, and that I think that for 70 years we've been seeing the same policy of occupation, of siege, and I can't take part in it. I'll be sent back to prison for another sentence.
It must play on your mind a bit.
I think to myself that I've gone through 30, I can take another 30, and I can take another 30 after that because I know that a lot of people support me.
It is not just those who are being tapped up by the IDF to serve on the front line that are showing their anger. The families of those who are being held hostage by Hamas right now, and indeed more than that, I saw anger being displayed at Israeli officials at the funeral of an IDF soldier as well.
I think it's amongst the relatives of the hostages where you see the most dissent towards the Israeli government. Broadly speaking, there is a division within Israeli society, and I am generalizing here, but there are those who think that the best course of action is to continue the military action at the fastest possible pace and thereby defeat Hamas, and that is the correct route. But there are others, and this is where the hostage families are particularly relevant, that think the government is prioritizing the military fight over any possible new hostage deal. And the longer that this war goes on, and the longer that it remains there is no further hostage deal, the greater that dissent and opposition grows. There was another example where many of those hostage families invaded a committee that was being held in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. They interrupted it and they shouted and demanded that politicians do more to rescue the hostages.
Ali, we've also seen relatives of hostages pitching their tents outside Netanyahu's residence in Jerusalem to make their opinions known. And I suppose also we should reflect on the fact that the tempo of the conflict itself has seen some pretty bloody days for those who do have family members serving within the IDF, and there has been a backlash to that as well.
Particularly this week, 24 Israeli soldiers died in a single day, 21 of them in a single instant. That was the worst day for the Israeli military since their ground operations began. Now, the Israeli military did lose many, many more than that on October the 7th itself. But this was the worst day, as I say, since the ground operations got underway. That is difficult for the Israeli people, and as much as they might support the Israeli military and even support the war, it is obviously hard when they suffer large numbers of casualties like that. It's not just the dead. Around 4,500 Israeli soldiers are being treated because they were wounded in the fighting in Gaza. That is a very high number, a very big ratio. And so it is having an impact on the Israeli military and the Israeli people. Of course, it is absolutely right that we look at the Palestinian side as well. More than 25,000 killed in Gaza, of which the Israelis reckon about 9,000 of those are Hamas militants. But that leaves 15, 16, 17,000. It's hard to be exactly clear on the figures, but that leaves a large number of those civilians.
Back to you in a moment, Alistair, but we're also, of course, joined by Daliah Scheindlin, an Israeli political analyst, author of the book, The Crooked Timber of Democracy in Israel, Promise Unfulfilled. Daliah, for the reasons that Ali's just outlined, do you think those losses for Israel have affected support for the war inside the country and indeed their view of Netanyahu himself?
I think there was a lot of speculation that this would cause Israelis somehow to turn against the war and call for a ceasefire, and that is probably not the case. I think more often what we're seeing in the Israeli general political or social environment, I should say, the social discourse, is that they should not have died in vain. Again, many people do not want the war to stop in a long-term way, and I think Netanyahu is quite aware when there's been, this sort of ongoing apparent indirect or direct negotiations or something for a possible future ceasefire, the big dispute between Israel and Hamas being that Hamas wants to see a permanent end to the war and Israel is considering a temporary ceasefire, whether it's 1 month or 2 months for the sake of hostage release. Israel is insisting that it go back to fighting afterwards, and I think the public is very much on that side as well. So I don't want to understate the very combative frame of mind right now in Israel.
Well, let's move away from current events and focus on the man himself. I mean, the longest-serving Prime Minister he may well be, but there was a tremendous amount of political turmoil and indeed those criminal charges hanging over him in the run-up to October the 7th and, of course, the horrors of that day.
He's always been a very divisive figure. I think that if you look at it in the broader scope, going back to the 1990s, I think he learned, or he had a political instinct that in a way predated what we've come to be familiar with now as the style of the global illiberal populist nationalist leader who capitalizes on pre-existing social divisions and instead of trying to unify, leverages them in order to shore up a very strong base and rile up strong public sentiments and convince himself that he is the only one who can stand strong before the enemies of the world and before internal enemies. I think, in a way, politically by 2019, he had been in power so long even by then, right? He had already been a full consecutive decade in power that some of his erstwhile political allies became fed up with him and kind of were chomping at the bit to get their chance at being in power and thought he'd been there too long. And the corruption charges were by then known. He was informally indicted in 2019. He began standing trial in 2020. And that's when we saw the severe coalition crises that led to him being unable to form a government, even with his erstwhile partners from the right-wing parties. So he has divided the right wing over those who will be willing to go into a government that he leads, and some of the right-wing parties that are against what he stands for as a leader and think that he has tainted the integrity of governance. Those kinds of parties have become now part of the opposition. But the final result is that Netanyahu was left with very few political partners, except for the most fanatical, extremist, theocratic, illiberal, authoritarian right-wing parties. Those are the only ones left standing who are willing to be in a coalition with him. And that's why the government is so extreme and has made such disastrous decisions for the country.
Is it possible, Daliah, that the coalition would have collapsed by now had it not been for the events of October 7th?
I am inclined not to think so. And the reason is because over the course of 2023, we saw an unprecedented social protest of the likes that Israel has never seen before. And the fact that you had hundreds of thousands of people out of a population of only barely 10 million on the streets for 39 weeks in a row, oftentimes more than once a week, who had mobilized such capacity that they were able to actually shut down the country at points. There had never been anything quite as intense in terms of public pressure against a government to fall. And the government simply said, we'll just weather this. Okay, they rolled back the initial policy that was so divisive and caused such fury among the public, which was, again, the attempt to completely undermine the independence of the Israeli judiciary and effect a kind of political coup. And if the government didn't fall over that, right, because they have a 64-seat majority out of 120 in parliament, it's not clear to me that they would have fallen in the remaining months of 2023. I wouldn't be surprised if the government would have collapsed over something, probably over issues related to the traditional things that break apart Israeli coalitions, religion and state, the possibility of drafting the ultra-Orthodox population into the army, which have traditionally enjoyed a widespread exemption from the draft and is always very divisive, or maybe that Netanyahu might not have gone far enough in completely annexing the West Bank, which his coalition partners clearly demanded over that this government do. And so if Netanyahu had failed to do that, the government might have collapsed over that before the end of a 4-year term.
What do you make then, Daliah, of the all-important question, to which I don't think we've still yet had an answer? Why on October the 7th did Israel, this state famed for its surveillance, famed for its intelligence, why did it not see this coming?
The answer to this question has been evolving over time. Or we were told that there was no intelligence about this at all, and we were asking the same question you are. It felt like an enormous breach of the contract between the people and the state and everything people believed in about the state, that they were competent to do these things. However, since then, what we've come to learn is that there was quite a bit of intelligence, and the intelligence was being collected, and the surveillance people were doing their jobs, and they had quite detailed assessments of plans that very much reflected exactly what Hamas actually did. And then the questions become far more severe. Why were those intelligence reports not heeded? Why did the government not take stronger steps to constrain or prevent or preempt what Hamas was doing? And the only answer anybody has ever been able to come up with is that on one hand, the government was convinced that Hamas was deterred, and this created a kind of image, a political concept. We call it the conceptia, that everybody just filtered the information through that. But I think that the real answer is much more political than that. And it's, to my mind, the most accurate explanation. As an analyst of Netanyahu's policy on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for all of the time he's been in power, he has very clearly wanted to avoid ever reaching something like a serious negotiation with a unified Palestinian leadership that would lead towards a political resolution of the conflict in the form of a two-state solution, because he is deeply defiantly resistant to the idea of an independent Palestinian state. The first step towards Israel reaching that kind of an agreement would have been a unified Palestinian government. And therefore, because of the division between Fatah in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza, it was in Netanyahu's interest to keep Hamas in power. It also served his interest to prove why Israel was under constant threat. But Netanyahu thought they had reached a sort of quid pro quo. He let and approved the money flowing from Qatar, keeping Hamas's government fairly stable. If Hamas would raise its head, there was something that Israelis had come to consider mowing the lawn, which are these intermittent wars tamping down Hamas's capacity, and that everybody was ultimately fine with that.
Daliah, Ali, back to you in just a moment when we will be discussing what happens next. Welcome back. Our Middle East correspondent, Ali Bunkall, and Israel-based political analyst, Daliah Scheindlin, still here. And of course, despite the bloodshed, the violence seemingly never ending, at some point the fighting will have to stop.
And this is the question everyone's asking, is what happens next? Who controls Gaza? Who will rebuild Gaza? Who has security control over Gaza? Who has security control of the West Bank? Will we have a separate Palestinian state? That is what Biden is pushing for. That is the British government position as well. That is what Arab states want. Netanyahu is not entertaining it. But let me tell you why I think this is the case. Today, Tel Aviv University have released some findings from a poll they've done. And I think this gets to the root of it, okay? They say that 27% of Jewish Israelis would support a two-state solution. 66% oppose one. Just over half of Jewish Israelis support the establishment of Jewish civilian settlements to be built inside Gaza. So what we got in a nutshell there is the majority of Israeli Jews don't support a two-state solution right now, and the majority, albeit a slim one, of Israeli Jews support actually building Israeli settlements inside Gaza. So Netanyahu's view on a two-state solution might be anathema to a wider Middle East. It might not be what Washington or London want to hear, but it is not an uncommonly held view here in Israel. And let's be honest, Netanyahu's a politician, and we all know that politicians do tend to form their policies, often based around the popular public view. And so I think that is an important thing to understand when we talk about Western drives to get a two-state solution.
Daliah, just a final thought from you. I mean, do you think that Netanyahu is especially affected by this international isolation he's facing because of his very explicit views on the two-state solution?
You know, I think Netanyahu, it's not that he's not upset about it. I think that Netanyahu believes that he can manage all of the international forces properly. He has long positioned himself as the country's only and best true global statesman. And frankly, up until now, he has done a pretty good job. He knew how to maintain just the right levels of support from the different sides of the global map that would keep Israel's interests where he wanted them to be. In other words, not sufficient pressure from the world to actually move ahead on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, sideline, marginalize the issue as much as possible, and keep this holding pattern. What we're seeing now is that there seems to be, for the first time, possibly a genuine change from those global stakeholders in the urgency of moving ahead towards a political resolution of the conflict, in the revived language about a two-state solution. I think if I were Netanyahu, I would be banking on history, because over the course of decades, neither the US nor the rest of the world has ever truly found ways to pressure Israel to change its policies.
And on top of that, look, Alistair, we are talking the day before the International Court of Justice responds to the South African genocide case. But I have to wonder, given that international isolation, no matter what the ICJ says, I mean, is Netanyahu likely to do what they ask of him?
The Israeli governments, past and present, and the United Nations don't tend to have a particularly strong relationship. Many Israeli governments have often felt that the United Nations has a degree of anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism running through them. And so that is the sort of the background to this. But I tell you what, they have been taking this ICJ process very seriously. They sent their own judge to be a part of the panel. And I understand that Netanyahu's been locked away over the last day or so with some of his key advisors working out what they're going to do depending on which way it goes on Friday. If the ICJ don't hand down an injunction ordering for the war to stop, but they do deliver a judgment that is very, very critical of the way that the war has been fought, that will also be very uncomfortable for Israel. The whole process is deeply uncomfortable for this country, a country that was born essentially out of a genocide, and now they are being accused themselves of committing genocide. That does not sit easy with people here.
Ali Bunkall, Daliah Scheindlin, thank you both very much indeed. The horror of October the 7th and the horrors that have followed cannot just be told in numbers alone, although they do remain incredibly significant. Hamas, for example, still holds more than 130 hostages and bodies of hostages. Israel has killed 25,000, of which they believe but 9,000 to be Hamas militants. That's it for today's Daily. We'll see you next time.